Welcome back to Running Remote Online. My name is Danny Page. I'm really happy to be back. And what a conversation that we have for you. Coming up momentarily, a fireside chat. Look at that. I love seeing that these introductions that we have for each of our talks. A great partnership as well with our production crew. We'll certainly thank them on the way out. A couple of quick reminders before we get into this conversation with David Barrett, the CEO of Expensify. Coming up, remember, closing out the program, our startup pitch contest, the hottest remote work centric startup will win $25,000 later on from our sponsoring accelerator. We're super excited to bring that to you at 4 p.m. Eastern time. I will be announcing that winner just before 5 o'clock Eastern. Also, remember, if you're in Spain like myself, or maybe you're in Germany, click on the translation tab, right? And thanks to our partners and Interprify, you can listen to these talks in Spanish or in German. As I bring in from the Remote Leadership Institute, Wayne, do you speak German? Maybe you could just do the translation for us next segment. We could save on the.
I am an Anglo-Canadian living in the U.S. I barely speak one language, although I can spell it. I can spell most words two ways. That's as close as it gets.
Wayne Turmel will lead this fireside chat here with David Barrett, the well-recognized CEO of Expensify. You know, when I saw the agenda come out, gentlemen, this was one of those conversations where I said, I can't wait for this one. Without further ado, Wayne, the floor is yours. The mic is yours, more important.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. The concept of a fireside chat when I live here in Las Vegas in May is kind of interesting, but we will just put our minds in a nice cozy environment. And speaking of cozy environments, you can already see David is looking very comfortable where he is.
Always.
David, the whole idea of this chat is the office without walls. And why don't I just toss you a softball to get it started, which is, for most of us, the last year and a half or so has been more than a little crazy. But I suspect it's been slightly different in your world. How has having so many people working from home and doing all that impacted what you do at Expensify?
Sure. I mean, well, obviously, Expensify, we deal with business travel, and so we know a thing or two about basically getting people between offices, and it's been a pretty exciting time when basically your core function gets outlawed by all of the world governments. And so it's been a pretty exciting couple of years here. But I think one thing we've seen internally and with our customers is that a tremendous amount of business can happen remote just fine. And the business travel aspect of it is not nearly as critical as I think people sort of assumed it would be. And I think most companies have been going through some sort of a transition, and I think we're just like ours as well, where we kind of have to figure out, how do we operate remote? What are the processes that we have that are critical, and what are just habits that we can break? And so I feel like the pandemic, which is horrible in so many ways, one of the silver linings is that it's kind of forced a degree of like a 2030 level of sophistication onto a 2020 marketplace. We've all been forced to learn how to work remote. And those of us who couldn't make the transition, like, it was really rough for them. But when you come out the other side of this, what comes out is going to be a completely different market and a completely different set of companies, where now the whole idea of like, oh, you know, can we be productive remote? That was just a theory before, like a question, but now it's just it's a certainty. And so I think the idea going forward, especially as you think about returning to the office, is really rethinking, how important are these offices and what is the function of this office? Before, offices were viewed as a necessity, but now I think we view them as a luxury. We view them as something that serves a purpose that goes beyond just functionality. But what is that purpose? And I think we're all kind of grappling with that.
Well, you raised a number of points, not surprisingly, and I need to kind of break this down into digestible chunks. But I want to start with something you said about this being a turning point. I feel like the remote work movement, both the people who really advocated for it and the people who feared it, it was building up and building up and building up, and we were waiting for something to push us across the Rubicon.
Well, this was something, all right. Yeah.
And this was the event. I think most sea changes happen with a defining event.
Yeah.
And I think this was the defining event for the remote work. I'm curious, when you were setting up Expensify at the very beginning, and especially over the last few years, how conscious was the move to remote, and how much of it just kind of morphed?
That's a really good question. And so I would say, so there's sort of, there's two aspects to that I think of. One is that we have a habit in the company from the very earliest days, is we take the whole company overseas for a month every year, including families and kids. And so basically, with the exception of 2020, every year we've gone to like Thailand, Cambodia, Croatia, Portugal, Ecuador, all sorts of places around the world. And so it's always been built into our culture that the company cannot get too attached to an office unless they don't want to travel. It's like, and the conversation I would always have with like new engineers when they join, they'd be like, hey, this is thanks so much for this job. Where's my desk? And it's like, oh, actually, we don't have any assigned seating. You can sit anywhere you like. And every day everything's wiped down clean. They're like, well, where's my 2 giant monitors? Because everyone knows you have to have these huge monitors to be productive. I'm like, well, that's interesting. Are you going to carry those monitors with you when we go travel to Thailand? They're like, well, no. It's like, are you saying you can't be productive when you go to Vietnam with us? Like, no. It's like, cool. I guess we just agreed you don't need those big ass monitors, do you, after all? And I think that's like so many of the habits of an office place that we just take for granted as like core requirements. And people will say things like, everyone knows this, even though actually it's like, how do we really know that? They're like, well, studies show that giant monitors, for example, help. It's like, have you read those studies? Do you even know what the studies are? Because I have read those studies. Those studies were done on a 1024 by 768 monitor, copying cells from Excel from one sheet to another. It's like, is that what you do every day? No? Well, then maybe that actually isn't that important in the first place. And so I think that for us, it was basically, we've already had this backdrop of kind of challenging the necessity of an office, and that sort of equipped us going into this whole pandemic.
Well, that's really fascinating, and I want to drill down a little bit more into that. I think for our audience, I want to make it really easy for them to ask the questions they want the answers to, because I know part of this audience are startup folks. They're young, their companies are just starting. Remote is kind of the default setting, or at least virtual, right? Some kind of hybrid mix of there's some office space and people working remotely, and the company's built that way from the start. For a lot of other people, they're trying to fix the boat while it's in the water.
Yeah.
And that's a totally different experience. And so I'm curious, what are the challenges, whether it's new hires coming in, and the monitor story is a great example, when somebody joins your company who hasn't worked remotely before? What is their experience? Both what do they discover to their delight, and what freaks them the heck out and makes them wonder if they're in the right place?
Super interesting, yeah. I mean, I kind of think there's two different challenges to working remote. And there's the remote challenge, and then there's a time zone challenge. And those are two different kinds of challenges.
Yes.
And I'd say most companies right now that were forced into being remote, there's if they were in person in the first place, that means they're all in the same time zone. And so they're only kind of like tackling half of the problem, if you will. And then it's basically a matter of, it's like, well, it's just like being in person, except over video. And I would say those are the kind of the easier challenges, because you can keep all your same habits. It's like maybe whatever physical habits you had, for example, if you were collecting mail at the office or something like that, it's like those physical habits and processes need to be changed. But all your virtual things, like doing calls, doing meetings and things like that, if you're in the same time zone, it basically kind of all works out. The real challenges come, and I think what separates kind of like I don't know what the right terminology would be, but basically there's like a single time zone company versus global companies. Like, and I like Expensify, we have offices all over the place. We have San Francisco, Portland, Michigan, New York, London, Melbourne, and we've got a whole bunch of people in between. So the sun never sets in the Expensify empire. And I think that in order to make that work, you have to have processes which do not depend upon specific time zones. And that's actually the bigger challenge, is because most people are accustomed to kind of a culture of lore, where basically you just sit down and talk with others, and if you have a question, you find that person, you ask them a question, you get the answer, and it's all based upon this idea of like synchronous communications. To move to a global company requires that you really embrace the concept of asynchronous communication. Basically, every time you sit down on a call with someone, that is something you can only do with 1/24th of the world. That means you can't do that same process with the other time zones of the world. And so at Expensify, the challenge that we've had going over the course of years is like, I think we solved that first problem pretty quickly about being able to, as a company, locate ourselves anywhere. But we were, for years, basically, we might be in any time zone, but we're all in the same time zone sort of thing. The real challenge happens when you start splitting an office or splitting your workplace into different time zones, because then all of your processes suddenly break. And I think that's where this idea of an asynchronous process comes down to. Now, and I guess maybe to elaborate what I mean by that. An asynchronous process is...
That's kind of where I was going to go, because it's easy for those of us who do this every day to kind of geek out and throw stuff. Yeah. But there are mere mortals on this call who perhaps are kind of looking for more fundamentals. So talk to me about converting the synchronous, got to do that, to asynchronous, how you do that. And then I want to talk about what that means to human beings. But let's start with just how do you do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that, I mean, this is, again, we can geek out on this all day, but I think that there is a huge mental shift between synchronous work and asynchronous work. And I liken it to the difference between being a single-threaded program to being a multi-threaded program. A single-threaded program, you know, again, because I'm a dork, is basically you can do one thing and you do it in order, and that's great. But at some point, you just can't do more because you're just limited by the time of the day. In order to do more, what you need to do is you need to form off additional threads. You need to get other threads or other people doing things. And so, but once you would, it's generally known in computer science that like asynchronous programming is just an order of magnitude more difficult than synchronous programming, because the techniques you have just have to change. And I think that applies to sort of, not even just from a management perspective, but just from like an everyday rank and file employee's perspective. To operate in an asynchronous environment is just 10 times more challenging than operating in a synchronous environment, but it's also 10 times more powerful, if not more. And that's because, and I guess maybe to kind of break this down to a real world example, I would say typically, again, this idea of how do questions get answered in your company, which sounds like a really basic place to start. And I would say almost every company starts with, it's like, first, you're very small. It's like, well, you have a question, you turn to the person on your left. If they don't know the answer, you turn to the person on your right. And that's basically your whole company. And so like you're going to either, if anyone knows, you can just talk directly. That's sort of a direct sort of network, if you will. The second would be kind of like a gossip protocol. Basically, it's like, oh, if the people sitting right next to me don't know, they can ask someone else and then relay the answer to it. It's very straightforward in this approach, but that process needs to be very fast. And so I'd say once you sort of, as you grow your organization, the people that are available to you in that moment don't know the answer. And so you have to do something else to go and find it from somewhere else. And if you're a synchronous company, that means you just start calling people. You like to, and because you demand, you were stuck in the moment until you can get an answer. And so you just have nothing to do but to start calling your whole Rolodex until you get an answer. That's very.
Or you call a meeting and hope to God the right person is in the meeting.
Exactly. But you can only call a meeting with people who are in that time zone. Meetings are incredibly exclusionary from anyone else in a different time zone. So I think the mental shift is to move into a different frame, where it's basically like we use Stack Overflow inside of our company. And so our process is, it's like basically if you have a question, the first thing you do is you check Stack Overflow to see if anyone else has already asked that question. Second is, if Stack Overflow doesn't have the answer to the question, you write that question in Stack Overflow such that actually it sends out the question to everyone else. Third, if you're still blocked and you really need an answer, then you can go and hunt out the answer and find it. But then what you do with it is not just absorb it, is you update Stack Overflow so the next person will actually find the answer for you. It's a big change. It's like a big mental shift to take kind of a write it down philosophy, where basically everything should be written down such that someone else can find it. And furthermore, your first instinct should always be to search what's already been written down before bothering anyone else. When you do that, you realize there's actually a tremendous amount of time that you can free up from everyone by not answering the same questions a bunch of time. And likewise, if you take this asynchronous process and it causes you to really think, well, do I need this answer right now? Or could I wait until tomorrow? And then if you say, well, I can wait until tomorrow, let Stack Overflow do its job. A day passes, someone writes the answer, it'll be there for you in the morning, and then you can actually go off and do something else. So I think asynchronous sort of workflows require rethinking the need for immediacy for your answers and getting comfortable with basically splitting things up. And now it's a complicated, or it's a more complicated work style, but it's a more powerful work style. I think that's one reason, like, Expensify is super small. We only have like 135 employees, and we're pretty big company from a customer perspective. And I think we're able to punch above our weight class because of this asynchronous style of communication.
I'm all about the asynchronous communication as a way of saving sanity. I'm all about that. One of the things that people have discovered during the pandemic, and this goes to how do you create a company culture and how do you create a place where people like to work. If all of your work is asynchronous, if all you're doing is interfacing with Stack Overflow, right?
Yep.
What does that do in terms of creating relationships inside the company, creating a culture? If all you're doing is inputting and taking out data, that doesn't seem like the most fun place to work.
It's a really great point. And this is one thing we really grappled with as well, because the further you go down this sort of asynchronous approach, like I have one meeting a week. I have literally only one scheduled meeting a week where I sit down and talk with people basically, and everything else I do asynchronously. Now I do a lot of one-on-one meetings basically, and in fact we built a system to ensure that I talk with every employee at least once every single year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually like higher than, like, as you get through hundreds of employees, it starts to add up. And so I think that our approach for maintaining relationships is first, really encourage one-to-one conversations, because the problem with a meeting is it consumes everyone's time, but only one person can talk. And so it's just a super inefficient time. And we say, it's like, well, you get FaceTime. It's like, yeah, kind of, but like not high quality FaceTime really. It's like, I would say it's much better for 10 people to each talk with one person for an hour than for them to all talk to each other for an hour, because they just don't get as much sort of like content, because again, only one person can talk in a meeting. So I think we really prioritize one-to-one conversations and in a fully connected manner. Like ideally, every employee is talking to every other employee at least once a year. Like that's the dream. Second, I would say is there's no substitute for in-person, but it doesn't need to be there all the time. I think of the one-on-ones and in-person is like recharging batteries. And they can charge pretty quick, but then you can consume that relationship over time. So it's like, that's why we try to meet up as a company at least twice a year. We travel overseas someplace once a year and call it our offshore. Then we travel someplace domestically, like in North America, and call it an onshore for like a week. And so we try to bring everyone together at least twice a year, such that they can kind of recharge their sort of social batteries, if you will. And then that's what keeps everyone remembering. It's like that comment they said in Slack in that document, that can be interpreted two ways. Either they're actually asking a legitimate question from a point of confusion, or they're a super dick. And it's like, I'm going to guess that actually they're actually well-intentioned because I hung out with that person. I had beers with that person. And I know that they're super nice. And so I'm going to go with the best of intentions sort of thing. But if you don't meet up after a while, you sort of lose that trust, and then everything falls apart.
I'm delighted that you say that, because one of the things when people say, no, we're going to be a virtual company, and the people in finance rub their hands and go, we never have to pay for another airline ticket and life is good. But one of the things that we've learned during the pandemic is teams that were together and highly functioning and knew each other and then, got diasporaed out into the world are maintaining those relationships pretty well, because there was already that bank of trust and relationship, and they knew that Wayne's a smart aleck. So when I say something, they don't automatically assume that I'm a terrible human being. They know me, and they know I'm just being a smart aleck. So this idea that remote is either or, right? That we're either in this
it doesn't have
totally
to be
remote environment or we're face to face. And the reality is more complicated than that.
I absolutely agree. And I think that this idea of recharging social batteries, I think is such an important one. Because if you can take their comment and replay it in your mind in their voice, and be like, oh, actually, when they say it, it doesn't sound nearly as bad. When a robot says it, then it actually sounds awful, or whatever that is. So I think, being able to develop asynchronous processes, being able to maintain the real world relationships. Another thing that comes up, and I don't know exactly how this fits in, but it's very important to us, is when it comes to compensation of your remote team. I think the standard is basically everyone is paid relative to the cost of living in their region, and I think that's screwed up. Our approach is we actually pay everyone globally according to San Francisco wages. So if you're in San Francisco, you live a comfortable life. If you live literally anywhere else in the world, you are super baller. And so as a result, it's look, we don't care where you work, and there's no penalty for working somewhere else. Otherwise, the idea is like, yeah, we don't care where you work, but if you work someplace cheap, you're going to get paid less. And that's like, well, that's weird. It kind of like penalizes certain locations over others, and it's kind of a weird attitude. We say, no, to be truly a remote first company means you have to pay a global wage. And then the individual is free to match that with whatever lifestyle they want. And we have people moving all over the place. Like when we first actually, we started off in San Francisco, and then our second office was actually in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And so that was like, oh, okay, there's a very different lifestyle up there, different kind of group of employees up there. Our third office was in Portland, and actually maybe it's Melbourne or London, I don't even know. But like our biggest office is in Portland, I'd say. And that'll happen because we have incredibly high employee retention. Like for a 12-year-old company, like all of our management team's been here like 8 years. Over half the company's been here 4 years. And in Silicon Valley, like 2 years is like a tour of duty, and like 4 years is like a death sentence. So the idea of actually sticking around longer than that is just shocking. But we had people sticking around for so long, and we hired people straight out of school, that after like 4, 6, 8 years, their life has changed a lot. They went from like just graduating to getting married, having kids, getting a dog, or whatever it is. And so being able, a remote first attitude is about supporting employees as their lives change, so that they can change where they live without changing where they work. And I think that sort of flexibility comes from a compensation perspective as well. So by having the ability to maintain your friendships, the ability to maintain your asynchronous workflows, and your same paycheck, is sort of all of those work together to create the conditions for true mobility.
Well, I'm really tempted to go down the rabbit hole because I am fascinated by the social implications of what you're talking about. Here in the West, if you, just as an example, you know, we spend 60% of our social interaction during the week takes place through work. It's been that way for 125 years, right? Because that's where we spend most of our time and where we meet most people. And during the pandemic, of course, some people have had way too much exposure, living in a house with kids bouncing off the walls and things, and people being isolated and lonely, which has been a huge issue for folks. And I wonder what that mobility, that taking that different approach that you're taking means long-term for folks. You know, people come in, a lot of us are used to meeting everybody through work, and that's our social life, and that's so much of our interaction. And this is going to be a huge change.
Well, so my interpretation of kind of that topic makes me think of, so we had our office in San Francisco, and we've got this beautiful, beautiful office, 16th floor. It's like an amazing office, but we found people's lives were changing, and they were all leaving San Francisco. Like it became very hard. Like they weren't leaving the company; they were just leaving San Francisco. And this happened before COVID. And we're like, wow, we see the writing on the wall. It's like this office is going to become a ghost town. Like what? And this is going to be depressing. At our critical mass, it's like it's just too big and too weird to be in a giant office by yourself, kind of thing. And so we're trying to think, well, what can we do to maintain the vibrancy of our workplace? Because to your point, it's not functional anymore. It's just social. Like we can work anywhere, and so it shouldn't be a burden to just show up to the office. It should be a joy. But that joy means that other people are there. And so we're kind of reflecting on this and thinking, it's like, well, why is it that as a company we travel like halfway around the world. And we find this coffee shop in Hanoi. And we're like, man, this coffee shop's such a great place to work. And it's like, what? Our multi-million-dollar office isn't as good as a random-ass coffee shop in Hanoi? Like, that doesn't make any sense. So one thing we thought, like, well, what makes the Hanoi coffee shop so awesome? And we realized, well, it's because it has other people there. That's one thing that's nice about the workplace, is it actually has people who don't work with you. Like, the odds of meeting someone new when you're sitting next to the same people every day are very low. And so we kind of had this idea percolate in the back of our mind. COVID happened, everyone had to go home, and we're like, well, no one's going to be in the office for a while, so let's go and rethink how our offices are. So we've actually spent all of COVID, and we've renovated all of our offices to be, they were nice before, but now they're insanely baller. But more importantly, we're adding to everyone a full espresso bar with barista and great cocktail lounge. So basically, we want to make it the coolest possible place to be, so that you choose to be there. And then furthermore, we're going to open it up to outside people. It's like, hey, anyone who wants to come hang out in our basically lounge, whatever, because you showing up makes our workplace better for our employees as well. And I think this idea of rethinking the workplace to be no longer a place of necessity, but a place of luxury, a place that you should actively want to be at because it is better than anything else out there. Now we don't need to, we need to compete with every other coffee shop in the world. We need to compete with your home. We need to compete with everywhere else. And to come out on top is not easy. But so I think offices become more important in the future because they're what can create that social glue that's so necessary for the teams. But they're harder because there's more competition than ever.
I've got two questions. One is for you and one is general. The general question is, I wonder the translation service for this, how Spanish and German translated insanely baller. I am dying to know what that looked like. The second thing, though, is we're talking about some really exciting changes. And some people are already there, and some of this is generational, and some of it is not, and some of it is cultural. But if somebody joins your organization today, mm-hmm. what is the one thing they have to unlearn?
The one thing?
Okay, the biggest thing.
Yeah, I would say, so when we hire, we're hiring for three criteria. We hire based on talent, with basically the ability to learn without being taught, teach what you know. Second, as ambition, the idea of having some genuine goal for your life and some evidence that you're pursuing that goal. And third is humility, the ability to work with other super talented, ambitious people without just stabbing each other in the back all the time. And notably absent from that list is experience. Experience is cheap. Experience just means that you didn't get fired. It's like what happened, it's the exhaust of your effort sort of thing. It's not actually a product. And so I think that experience is the least important of them. And I would say in many cases, experience is actually a huge burden because everyone is trained around certain ideas, whether it's come like a structure of hierarchy. Like, for example, at Expensify, no one has any titles. There's no internal hierarchy, and no one reports to anyone else. Everyone shows up, does their best job, and then we have a voting system twice a year to decide who gets paid. Everyone votes. Who should be paid more, A or B, B or C? We go through this whole process, and then it creates a formula, and boom, this just spits out your compensation. So there's no one to brown nose. There's no one to dominate. It's like you don't have to worry about any individual relationship affecting your pay because like everyone contributes to it. And so it makes there's a whole bunch of things about our company which are weird and which no one has any experience with. And so we actually find it's easier for people with no experience to drop in and be like, oh, I guess this is how work is. I guess what we do is we just travel around the world and hang out in beaches. And I guess we just do a Super Bowl ad, even though we don't advertise. So we do a lot of things. And so I think that experience can be a tremendous asset, but that asset comes at as a high cost. It's like if you have experience, but you become calcified by that experience, then that's a huge risk to the individual. So going back to your questions, like what's the number one thing to unlearn? I would say the necessity of hierarchy would be probably the first thing. Everyone is so assumed as like, I have to have a boss. I don't want a boss, but I have to have one. Right. Also, I don't want a boss, but I want to be one. And I was like, titles are so stupid, but I need one. It's like they have all these ideas which are so hard to break down. And they all kind of eventually come down to the necessity of hierarchy. That'd be one sort of class of problems to break down. The second, I would say, and this is where experience is also a challenge, is the humility to collaborate with people at different experience levels and not be offended. So when we basically, we hire everyone with the exact same process. It doesn't matter how much experience you have. And likewise, everyone, I guess I would say, starts at the bottom, but there is no bottom. Everyone starts in the same place. And no one gives a shit about your experience. You show up and it's like, oh, that's awesome. You've been working for 50 years this particular thing. That particular idea is not good. Or you can't explain why that idea is good. And so I think the ability to, people say like, oh, yes, of course, I can work with anyone. But in most companies, which are hierarchical, there's also an implied deference. And so you have to unlearn the expectation of deference and actually realize it's like, no, you will be judged based upon the quality of your work, and that is it, because no one knows or cares where you worked at before. They only look at the quality of work right now. And so I'd say and when it comes to deference, and where that really starts to become a problem is, I would say, defining what problem you're trying to solve before solving it. And that sounds so obvious, but almost no one does it. No one's taught to do it. It's not our instincts. Most people are like, hey, wouldn't it be great to do this? And I was like, yeah, that does sound fun. And there's never a discussion as to why. It was just basically, do we want to do X? And I was like, yeah, X sounds good. It's like, cool, let's do X. A habit that we've developed, and I think it's really important for this asynchronous communication style, is to say, like, whoa, what problem you're trying to solve with X? And most people are like, I don't know. I just want to do it. I'm like, okay, well then we're not going to do it if you can't define the problem. And then people get very offended when you actually pin them down. It's like, no, what specifically are you trying to solve, for whom? And is that important? Do a lot of people have that problem? Is it critical to them? How does that rank against other problems we're trying to solve, and things like this? So I'd say this isn't specifically a remote thing, but I would say so much of the in-person environment is easy, because it's like, I can actually physically lord over you. I can be taller than you. I can count on my gender. I can count on my my age or my wealth to intimidate you. And you were expected and been trained to defer to me based upon my hierarchy. And that just makes everything easy. When you work remote, when you strip away the hierarchy, you strip away a lot of the stuff, the time zones and things like this, suddenly you're being held to such a higher standard, to like an intellectual standard. So I think the key to working remote is not just having the same paycheck, being able to work anywhere, being able to work in different time zones, but it's also being held to a high intellectual standard where your work has to stand on its own, because someone on the other side of the globe is going to receive and process your work, and you're not there to defend it.
It's interesting. I think half our audience are lying on the floor bleeding from the ears at the idea of half of what you just said there, and the other half want to go work for you. But what, and I'm actually trying to flip a coin and decide which side I'm on. But talk to me a little bit about the practical mechanics of bringing somebody on board. When you have an office and new kid comes into the office, we know how that works. We know how it's worked for 100 years. That's tough to do when the new kid is in Dar es Salaam. So how does that work, the mechanics of bringing somebody on board?
Great question. So onboarding is a real challenge, and here's how we do it. So we're basically a GitHub organization, like most people. And so basically all of our processes boil down to GitHub tickets of some kind. And so when it comes to any kind of, or maybe I'll step back and say, most organizations are people-based organizations, meaning, and that's where the hierarchy comes in. It's basically, we're going to split up all of our decisions between a certain number of people, and then they're going to delegate. And then one person makes the decision on behalf of the whole company, and then everyone else goes along with it. And that's fine, and that works, and it scales, but it has challenges. We're a process-driven company. No individual person is in charge of any decision. Like basically anyone can join any conversation, weigh in on any topic. And everything just comes down to like, oh, if you want to do this thing, well, here's the process for doing it. Oh, you want to do a thing that has no process? Cool. Just write up what you think is a good process, and that becomes the process. Start following. Oh, you don't like the process? Well, then change the process. That's cool too. But just make sure that everyone knows what the process is, and then we follow it. And so I would say this idea of a process-based organization, when it comes to onboarding, just means it's like, well, what do we want to do? we create a script that just basically creates a whole bunch of GitHubs for a new hire and then randomly assigns them out. It's like, okay, we want you to talk to these different people about these different things. Read these particular documents. Close the issue when you have. We have a milestone for the candidates. They're like, hey, this is how long, how far they are through the onboarding process. We can ask questions. We can get status updates. We have a lot of scripts like one called Melvin Bot that basically we tag all issues by how frequently do we think this issue should be updated? Is this a daily issue, an hourly issue, weekly, or monthly? And if it's basically, it's like, hey, we tagged this at daily, but it's been 2 days and no one's done anything. Is this actually daily? Or I'm gonna erode it to weekly. Or if you disagree, someone do something about it. And so I think it's about creating systems and processes which are not based around the idea of partitioning decisions between a bunch of people and then trusting them. It's much more, let's all collaborate to find the best possible process, and then let's execute that process. And if anything goes wrong, let's fix the process, not blame the people involved.
That is amazing. I love that. And I am resisting the urge to just continue geeking out because we want to make sure that we have time for questions from somebody other than me. So, Danny, we're calling you in here, brother. It's Q&A time, right?
I think we're all geeking out here. I even forgot where my mic was. I mean, I think we all are a little bit. And you know what? Wayne, you got to ask a lot of questions. I want to ask a question, and it's not necessarily remote specific, David, but it starts with the smaller monitor and few meetings, right? Like, how do you make the decision and how do you make things work when you run a successful business in sort of like an antithetical way, right? Because we all learn in startup world that we have to, have a stand up at this time every day, and we have to, everybody needs a huge right? Like that's the way you do it in the Bay Area. That's what you're taught. So where do you find the courage to do that, and how do you execute it as well? Is my question.
Okay, so I said the most important piece of advice, and it's so obvious, but almost no one does it. Okay, it's gonna blow your minds. Don't do anything that you think is stupid. Now, again, that sounds obvious. It's like, well, obviously, you don't want to do anything that thinks stupid. But when you think of all these processes, most people are like, yeah, this is dumb. This is dumb. We got to do it. Like that whole idea of like, this is stupid, but we have to do it. Just what? It's like, of course, I was like, I think this is a bad idea. I'm going to do it and get bad results. Like, what did I learn? I was right or something? I'm not even sure. And so just don't do stupid shit. And like, it sounds so obvious, but that is the core of all of it. Like we say internally, we've got only 2 rules. 1, get shit done. 2, don't ruin it for everyone else. Like that's it. Like those are the only rules we have. And there's a lot of variations about how to apply those rules, but like, it really comes down to like, are you getting shit done? Cool. Are you doing it in a way that's ruining it for everyone else? That's a problem. And so I'd say, from a courage perspective, I think it really comes down to also try to build a company that you want to work at. Like, it's your choice. It's your company. Like, most people don't. They're like, no, I'm going to do this thing that I think is dumb, and I'm going to do it anyway, even though it makes for a company that I don't want to work at. And then eventually, I'm not going to want to work here, and I quit. And so like, well, just don't do that. Just don't do the stuff that you know is not going to work. And have the courage to actually say like, hey, do we all agree that's stupid? Yeah, anyone? Okay, can we just not do that? I mean, it's weird how much courage it takes to do that. But once you start building a habit around that and surround yourself with other people that also just don't think like, what's normal? Because normalcy has nothing to do with it. It's like either, is it possible? Is it legal? Cool. Like then it's on, then we're game.
Wayne, you're a bit of a contrarian too. I know you've been interviewer, but I can turn you into interviewee for half a minute here. I mean, how do you respond to what David said, and how would you think about that question, especially having had this conversation with him?
Yeah, I think that, it's funny when my daughter was little and she has leadership potential, I think is the way we describe it now. We used to call them bossy little kids, and now they have leadership potential because we're not supposed to call them bossy. And I remember her coming to me because the kids wouldn't play with her. And I said, well, do you think there's a reason? do you think you're being a little bossy with them? And nobody likes to be told what to do. And she says, well, how else will they know what I want?
Right.
And, you know, in the 6-year-old brain, that makes perfect sense. And as we think about how do we build companies and how do we want to do this, we all know what sucks about work. We all know what has driven us crazy our entire lives. Why would we then create something that inflicts that on other people?
Right. And that's part of it, right, David, is that you wanted to build a company that you want to be at every day. And I know you've said that, but I just want to reinforce that point. Well, why do anything else?
Okay, here's why you do something else. And this is, I think, comes down to the mythos of the serial entrepreneur. Like the only other time you use the word serial is serial killer. And I think that the idea of a serial entrepreneur, like, why is this a good thing? If we say it's like, you know, what I do,
right.
As I met this, you know, my partner, we raised a family. It was wonderful. And then I sold them. And I did it again 7 times. People were like, you're a fucking monster. But for some reason, we're like, oh yeah, I started this company. And we're like a family together. We work together. We have so much fun. And then I sold that whole company. And especially because in Silicon Valley, the best practice is you sell the company, the founders and the VCs get rich, the employees get fucked. And this happens again and again. And so I think it really comes down to the leader. It comes down to the CEO. Like, I wanted to create a company. I wanted to create one company that I work at for the rest of my life. And everything else has come from that. And now, if you are a CEO that's basically saying like, no, I want to build a company and sell it, then basically your entire optimization is, I'm trying to build something that I'm going to package up, and my employees are my product. And I think that's actually a super fucked up concept. And so I think it really comes down to ask the CEO, like, what is your plan for 30, 50 years from now? Tell me what you want to do to retire with this company. And if they can't, I'm like, this person is like, I'm not the customer of my CEO. I'm the product of my CEO. And they're trying to package me somewhere else.
We've just got a couple minutes to close this out. Wayne, I don't think you'll be able to answer this question. I'm just going to ask it of David. It comes from our show organizer and producer, Igor. Was Expensify's Super Bowl advert successful? Wayne, I don't think you
massively successful, but not in the way that people
really.
Okay. And that basically we were profitable, but we wanted to get even more profitable. And so it's like, okay, so how do I encourage my team to basically do something to stick around and do something big? So I'm like, we're just going to do a freaking Super Bowl ad. And by basically just holding out that challenge to the company that felt impossible, and we could basically did all the hard work to make it possible. And now everything's great. And so basically by holding out a hard challenge, it just forced everyone to step up their game and try bigger risks and bigger swings. And now the company is so much stronger as a result. So did it make customers? It made some. It was super fun, but more importantly, it made the company itself much more successful.
Wow, what a conversation, David. Wayne, any final thoughts? As the moderator here and leading this fireside chat.
I guess I would say, so it's mentioning about jobs. We are hiring. Go to we.r.expensify.com or just jobs.expensify.com or just hit me up on Twitter at dbarrett. And I'd love to talk to you.
Wayne, final thoughts from you as our moderator here?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people have learned a lot, and they're going, yeah, but we're not David and we're not Silicon Valley. Here's what I think about it. Remote work has always worked. Genghis Khan ruled half the world and never held a Zoom account. Julius Caesar did great out in the field. It's when he went back to the office that everything went to hell. So it can be done if you are mindful and keep in tune with your people, just very much as David has been telling us for the last 35 or 40 minutes.
Brilliant stuff. David, thank you so much. Wayne as well. It's such a memorable conversation. And I just really appreciate you both for being with us this evening where I am, but this morning where you both are. Thanks again, gentlemen.
Hey, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a delight.
Yeah, David Barrett, the CEO of Expensify, Wayne Turmel, Remote Leadership Institute. You got a book out, by the way, Wayne. Just want to give you a little shout out there for the work that you've done